What if you had to choose between accepting unlimited liability or walking away from a deal? Most people would pause, and rightly so. I'm Mike, founder of Starlit Contracts, where we help you to negotiate and use contracts with confidence. We're looking at caps on liability and unlimited liability in this video. Some forms of liability can't be capped, and which ones depend on the law that governs the contract. Liability for personal injury and death are typical examples of liability that cannot be capped under many governing laws. So how does it work in practice? The main question to consider is, should liability be capped, and if so, at what value? The value can vary enormously depending on the products or services provided by a supplier and the sector in which you're doing the deal. It's quite common, when a party supplies goods, for the cap to be linked to the value of those goods. Alternatively, when a party provides services, the cap may be linked to the value of those services. If you've got a long-term contract, where goods or services are provided over several years, the cap can be linked to the payments made under the contract over the course of a year. Is this something you should care about? Having a cap on liability is one of the most important clauses to manage risk, and it's even more important if you don't have a consequential loss disclaimer, nor other strategies to minimize your risk if things goes wrong. That said, it's rare to see a cap on liability in non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs for short, and in Memorandum of Understanding, or MOUs for short. You can check out our separate videos on these types of contractual agreements. Let's look at a practical example together. Faulty Services Supplier Limited enter into a contract with the customer. The supplier's work had severe defects that cost the customer an additional 50% of the contract price to fix. Supplier's liability is capped at 10% of the contract price, though liability for gross negligence is excluded from the cap. To put it in different words, the supplier's liability for gross negligence is unlimited. What can go right for the customer in this situation? The supplier and the customer agreed in the contract that the supplier's liability for gross negligence is not capped. So if the customer can demonstrate that the supplier was grossly negligent, then the 10% cap on the supplier's liability should not apply. In this case, the supplier relied on its low cap on liability and did not have a disclaimer for consequential loss in the contract, nor any other exclusion of liability like a sole and exclusive remedies clause. This means that the customer was able to recover the full 50% of the contract price that they spent to fix the defect. What could go wrong from a customer perspective? The contract states that supplier's liability for gross negligence is unlimited, but the contract doesn't define what gross negligence means, and the definition is not clear under the law that governs the contract. If the supplier denies that they're liable for gross negligence, then the customer has a difficult decision to make. Do they pursue a formal claim through the courts, which can be expensive, time-consuming and stressful? Or do they decide not to make a formal claim and see what they can achieve amicably through discussion with the supplier? In this case, since the supplier does not accept liability for gross negligence, the customer decides to accept 10% compensation, up to the liability cap, rather than invest the time and energy needed to pursue a claim through the courts, which might not be successful. Now let's look at a sample clause and some key considerations. Supplier's liability to customer is capped at 50% of the contract price, the average annual price of the contract, or whatever other reference point you choose, except for any liability that cannot be capped under applicable law. You can also add exclusions to the liability cap, such as for gross negligence and willful misconduct. The first question you might have is, why is the clause capitalized? Under some governing laws, limitations of liability and some disclaimers and exclusions from liability should be prominently shown to ensure that they are enforceable. Capitalizing words, making them bold or using a different font are ways to make a clause more visible. If you're unsure whether the law that applies to your deal requires this, then consider playing it safe and taking these steps. Next, if your limitations of liability clause uses words that don't have an established definition under the governing law, or they can be interpreted in different ways, then it's good practice to insert a suitable definition in the contract. By way of example, the words gross negligence and willful misconduct in this clause are well-established concepts and have clear definitions under some governing laws, but not for all. And the clause continues. The limitations and exclusions of liability in this agreement apply whether a claim is based on a breach of contract, tort, including negligence and strict liability, or under any other legal theory. This clause sets out the intention that the limitation of liability and exclusions of liability apply in all cases, no matter the legal basis upon which a claim is made. For example, there could be a claim that a party is in breach of their contractual obligations, or that the party was negligent. It is common under some governing laws that a party will make both claims at the same time. The clause makes clear that the same caps and exclusions will apply in all such cases. To wrap up with your key takeaways, think carefully about the cap or caps on liability that are suitable for your deal. Choose levels that fit your risk profile and make sure that such caps apply to claims made under all legal theories. Next, define key terms that are used in your liability clauses, such as gross negligence and willful misconduct, especially if the meaning of such terms is not clear under the law that governs the contract. Finally, determine what types of liability should be uncapped, if any, but be mindful that suppliers may want to increase their price for higher risk deals. If you're ready to take your next step to negotiate and use contracts with confidence, then visit us at starlitcontracts.com, where you can access more content, participate in interactive sessions, and be part of our community. I look forward to seeing you there.